I'm not sure whether to use a microphone or not. I'll use my old Stormont Packer's voice, but I'll persist with the microphone. Like Anna, I was tempted to sort of approach the question that was posed by the organisers about is neoliberalism killing social democracy by simply saying yes and sitting down. Because, and many of you in the room have read a lot of this, I think millions of words have been spent cataloguing the decline of social democratic ideas, dismantling of policy achievements, political parties, and the bedrock institutions of which unions are only the most obvious. I think Anna was much better placed than me to determine whether the illness to social democracy was caused by something that can be usefully and accurately summarised as neoliberalism. What I intend to do, I think, is ask a slightly different question, and perhaps this comes from my background as an organiser who is an accidental thinker, and ask what might instead be done to improve things. So what is actually the response that we need to have to Anna's very accurate and comprehensive, I might say, diagnosis? And I think that's important for internally focused reasons as well. For one, I think a more complex set of clauses, including internal causes, seems to me to be intuitively likely for the decline of social democracy. To extend the illness analogy, what I'd suggest to you is perhaps it's a case of what doctors would call comorbidity. After all, many social democratic parties and institutions voluntarily adopted the language, some of the personnel, and much of the tool belt of bloodless, sensible centrist technocracy all on our own. Nobody forced us to do it. In any event, I tend to dislike the term neoliberal as deployed in political discussions. I don't apply that to Anna's paper, which was using it in a carefully calibrated and analytical sense, but in general political discourse. It tends to be simply used as something, a bunch of things people on the left don't like. And on that basis, I think it lacks analytical clarity. I think it tends to obscure what we need to do, and I think it's basically a club. And clubs are useful for rhetorical purposes, but sometimes they're not useful for much more than rhetorical purposes. Incidentally, for the same bucket of reasons, I basically don't like the term progressive either, because I think what it does is imply a unity of purpose among people who have fundamentally different visions of society. And I think that's not just wrong, I think it's actually dangerous. Papering over the cracks is actually a pejorative. It's probably worth remembering that. Oh, maybe this is just my own involvement with these questions. I was once called both a leftard and a neoliberal for the same tweet, which was about climate policy, incidentally. So maybe it's just a matter of where I sit in the range of things. So, with any number of background examples you choose to pick, please pick your own. I choose to refer to the fact that the French presidency is now officially down to finance versus fascist. Rather than dwell on causation per se, it seems to me the more useful and urgent task is to debate the praxis and the program necessary to respond to where our society is now and where we're headed. The good news is that what remains of the core architecture of Western social democracy remains insanely popular. Many of you will have seen the GOP congressmen at town halls being absolutely terrorised by Trump voters about congressional threats to social security, which is the crowning glory of American liberalism. You'd also know the fact that government single-payer healthcare is effectively sacrosanct anywhere it exists. The further good news is that people are actually very good at identifying what they don't like about what we call neoliberalism, understanding that's not a term in common discourse. This is true sometimes in particular of people who vote for candidates like Hanson and Trump and Le Pen. And it's also true of people of colour and poor people who decline to get out the vote for people like, or candidates like Hillary Clinton. They understand their broken communities, they understand their underemployment in insecure jobs, and they understand bad and non-existent services. People know what they don't like about this instinctively and react about it quite viscerally. Dealing with the future of social democracy does involve responding to many of the things that people do respond in that visceral way to that they don't like. the individualised, atomised and financialised society that Anna described, where markets dominate and are more often rigged by governments in favour of incumbents than regulated by them, a society with rising inequality and in particular with privatised risk. So what I now want to do then is to begin to answer the question, instead of the one I was asked to address, which is a classic union organiser move, is a collective future still possible? Because I think that's actually the fundamental thing that's in front of our political institutions, political parties, our thinkers, and our civil society actors. Now, being what I like to describe as being a cynical optimist, my answer to that question is yes. But only if we accept that, because we will have to deal with different problems in a different society. It will necessarily in both its policy prescriptions and its general form not look particularly like, or at least be very different to, traditional social democracy. And even then, I think a collective future is possible only if we deal properly with questions of power, questions of civil society, questions of politics, of policy, and in particular of technology. That's not an exhaustive list of the things I think are important, they're what I reckon I can get through. So the first thing that we've got to do is cheerfully re-embrace that this is all actually about power. Too few people broadly on the left of politics do not want to talk about power anymore and lack a power analysis to any given situation. I routinely, as some of you have heard me say, go back to Polanyi's definition of the social democratic project. It is the conscious subordination of the market to democracy. Now, we can't unpack that statement entirely, but what I want to focus is on one word: subordination. Subordination is a word about power. The project in the end is about democratic institutions, which is not just the state, it is about civil society, acquiring, using and maintaining power over what would otherwise be the overwhelming power of actors in the market sphere. This involves challenging powerful forces and acting against their interests. They tend to fight back. If we give them a blood nose, they'll give us a black eye. Too many on our side seem to regard this whole process with some distaste, as if politics was just about the best ideas. Others have called this something like West Wing syndrome, named after the TV show, but I've coined my own term, which is evidence-based policy disorder. Now, the point I want to make is that it is never enough just to be right. If the smartest guy in the room has no connection to power, they are just an annoying smartass. It is necessary for us to have a theory of both acquiring and using power. It's not enough to just be smart and have good ideas. Now, of course, our permanent and occasional opponents have no such qualms. Capital has the profit motive, which very much keeps it disciplined and united. It's just automatic. Political conservatives and reactionaries have a fundamentally different pathology of power to most of the social democrats that have held office over my lifetime. And that's clear. It's clear enough from what they do when they're in government, but it's also clear, I think, from the fact that much of their program, no matter what it's about, is described with the cadence of an Old Testament prophet. It's a language of judgment. It's a language of punishment. It's a language of reward only for the good. They have a pathology of power which they act out. As Corey Robin put it, the animating purpose of conservatism was to be a mode of counter-revolutionary practice, picking up one of the points that Anna made, that defends existing hierarchy and non-democratic power. In our country, the coalition makes no concession whatever to any policy position of the centre-left. It makes no concession to the legitimacy at all of our institutions, whether that is a trade union, whether that is an industry super fund or anything else you want to name. And they make no concession to personnel. They routinely purge even the most distant fellow traveller. It's like prisoner's dilemma, but we're the only ones still playing the game. Second, social democrats used to understand social democrats need to understand that rather than being able to rely on the support of strong, pre-existing civil society institutions and the customary loyalty of something close to a plurality, if not in some societies a majority of voters, that one of its goals must now be to help create the space for people to organise into new forms of collectives that speak to their interests and lives now. Much of the substructure of social democracy is no longer there. As I've written elsewhere, solidarity and collective action is a learned habit that people and indeed whole societies can forget. Rebuilding it will be hard, but in my view it's vital. When it is rebuilt, the political party or parties that sit at its head will be one element of a network that has power in aggregate, that lets people help themselves, and not some controlling mothership capable of issuing commands that bend society and the economy to its will. 3 examples. The present institutional form of unionism is not its only possible form. Its current form is a function of economic activity as it was arranged 120 years ago in Australia and is now a legacy of statute law. Likewise, state ownership or the private joint stock company are not the only ways to organise economic affairs, and neither really dominated until the 20th century. What is the space social democracy can create to allow cooperatives or other forms of economic actor to be formed and to prosper? Why, for example, is our corporate tax system structured so as to favour debt over equity, debt of course being provided by banks, in a way that anchors financialisation in the range of businesses which require little of it? This overlaps, in my view, with the way we do politics. Just as we haven't seeded, built and supported new forms of collective organisation and participation, we have limited our political engagement with the community to what I call occasional shallow mobilisations rather than deep organising. A very confronting, at least to me, new book by a US labour organiser analyses 3 possible approaches to social change. She talks about advocacy, based on having the best ideas. She talks about mobilising, which is about utilising generally the same part of a base to periodically take actions on issues or campaigns. And for those of you that go to protests about various issues and see the same folks, you're part of a mobilisation approach. And the third option is organising, which involves building a permanent and much wider movement for change which extends beyond a narrow activist base. In Australia, I think we're pretty good at the first. We've got a lot of well-argued policy papers. I've written some of them myself. We occasionally pull off the second, mobilisation, but generally only in opposition to things, never to move a forward program, at least in my adult life, and we never even really try the third, a deep organising of building a social movement. I think we need to understand and embrace the role all 3 play. Which brings me to public policy. There's something of a running joke, including on social media among younger left-leaning policy wonks in Australia, that when any given policy problem is raised, within a few moments, someone will suggest that the solution is income contingent loans. We're thinking about calling this Chapman's Law, named after the creator of the HEX system. And we also think that shortly after someone proposes income contingent loans, someone will propose a voucher system with a contestable market supervised by the government. That is what the Productivity Commission does, as Anna rightly pointed out. I once gave a speech suggesting that Productivity Commission reports were like East German shoes. You could have any colour you like, any ones you liked, as long as you wanted the size 7.5 brown ones, because that's all there was, because every report they issue is in effect entirely identical. But the joke demonstrates the extent to which our policy class has internalised a very narrow logic of what is available in the sense of public policy solutions and internalised the logic of the market, whether it makes sense or not, whether it's been demonstrated to work in these contexts or not. And nowhere, I'd suggest, is this more stark than in the design of the Ndis, which is an individualised voucher system where disabled people buy services in a contested market supervised by the government. A system that is falling apart even as they are building it. A system that I confidently but very sadly predict will be the subject of a Royal Commission in not too many years, which will hear evidence of waste, profiteering, abuse of extremely vulnerable people, and appalling labour market outcomes for the workforce involved. Similarly, I am deeply unconvinced by the push, supported by an increasing number of people on the left, for universal basic income. UBI, of course, started as a right libertarian prescription, which would allow for the state to be dismantled, as all would have an income sufficient to access what they needed in the market. It's not a proposal supported by some on the other side on the basis that it's as well as the welfare state. It's a proposition some of them support because it's instead of the welfare state. UBI, in my view, also makes no sense using a power analysis. I want you to imagine for a moment a world in Australia where we had enough power to restructure the tax system to collect the revenue sufficient to fund UBI. We're talking billions of dollars in additional taxation on capital and enormously high effective marginal tax rates on personal income. Now, if we had the power to do that, and we had the political coalition capable of delivering that and voter support, is what you really want to do with that write a cheque to everybody? Is that the best we can come up with in terms of a solution? The point is, if we have the political coalition capable of achieving something like UBI, I think it can be put to better purposes. Longing for the days when the levers of national government were connected to everything, I think, is also a little bit pointless. But so is tinkering around the edges or just cleaning up some of the mess capitalism makes won't really do either. But frankly, not doing stupid things that make the situation worse or which merely illustrate a policy impotence in the face of modern challenges is also a necessary thing to achieve. And I put Ndis in that last bucket. But we must also, I think, have a wider conception about what prosperity means that is not, I won't describe it as post-material, but put things like livable cities, public space, and yes, even the old-fashioned industrial claim of entitlement to private time to do with as we wish at the centre of a broader conception of what a social democratic project looks like. And so finally to information technology. Now, my concerns aren't merely privacy concerns, although there are a series of obvious privacy concerns there. My issue really is that the principal examples of an Australian progressive, response to these issues has been in relation to some pretty marginalia associated around the side or stuff that was actually pretty silly. So the first was a ridiculous attempt and self-defeating to the people that rely on that information in terms of public policy to get people to scab on the census on the basis that there was information retained. It was idiotic. And secondly, about the only other thing you've heard about these questions from the political class has been a bit of grandstanding from the Greens around metadata retention that was largely ineffective. Rather, what I want to refer to is the fact that technology is here now and emerging very rapidly that results in an unprecedented ability for governments and corporations to develop highly detailed and ever more accurate models of individual motivations, behaviour, preferences and the trajectory of a person's life. In essence, to use a smartphone or a tablet is to subject yourself to continuous psychometric profiling. You create an incredibly intimate and detailed portrait of yourself, including matters that you've probably never talked to anybody about. Now, scholars have begun to talk about the emergence of a control society where we are governed by invisible rules, like our browser web history, our electronic medical records, and our credit scores. In many parts of the US, police are currently dispatched to citizens' houses, almost always people of colour, to warn them that a computer model has indicated to the officers that they are likely to commit a crime. Any number of pop science books with titles like Weapons of Math Destruction, get it, WMD, warn of what mischief opaque or totally secret algorithms can cause to individuals and communities, including by hiding discrimination that would be unlawful if done openly. So refusing a bank loan to someone based on an algorithm which effectively operates in a way to exclude African Americans, for example. A remarkable recent book by a sociologist who's also a computer scientist is about virtualization, or what is known in common parlance as the cloud. And what he says is, and this is perhaps one area where I have a slightly divergent position to Anna in relation to the role of the state, or at least I think there's a different issue. He says the cloud as an idea has exceeded its technological platform and become a metaphor for the way society organises and understands itself. The data in the cloud redistributes existing and, in my view, creates new forms of power for both corporations and for governments. But it has a topography of power that is related to networks, which are built by governments and corporations and interlinked, as much as it does to anything like a sovereign border. So, beyond the realm of things like credit scores, there's also a role here for finance. Now, I haven't had time to discuss finance in detail, but there's something quite important about this. There is an emerging tapestry of tech and money, which is being woven quite tightly together and has a blanketing effect on our lives. Now, sometimes this is joint ventures between tech firms and banks. Sometimes it's tech firms becoming what are in effect shadow banks, quasi-deposit-taking institutions with all the attendant risk but with none of the prudential oversight. We know this, I think, from our own interaction with products like PayPal, with our own interactions, for those of you that have used it, with things like Apple Pay. Interestingly, the economy where this is at the most advanced in the current form is actually China, where Tencent, Weixin, Baidu and Alibaba, which are usually described with enough accuracy for this purpose as being Chinese Facebook, Chinese Google and Chinese Amazon, if you get what those companies are all at the centre of digitising consumer and small business banking and finance. They are an enormous proportion of consumer payments are now made via, in China, are now made via smartphone platforms that are offered by not a bank but a tech company. And what that gives the tech company as well as the bank is enormous information about the spending habits, right down to literally every cent people spend, to build into larger and larger models. Meanwhile, the only technology that looked like it might actually do the banks in, which is blockchain technology, or what sometimes known as Bitcoin, the banks globally are trying to standardise, in their view, i.e. that's monopolise in normal language, as they did with things like credit card clearing systems and FPOS, the way blockchain would be used, which would otherwise give the ability as a peer-to-peer process for people to not to have to use a bank to remove counterparty risk. All of this technology, which we think we might be able to use for good, can also be used for very seriously evil, in my view, circumstances. There is some debate about the extent to which this big data modelling to serve targeted messages to individuals, even messages that explicitly contradicted each other, was a part of Trump's win. There's a firm called Cambridge Analytica, which has been active in European and American politics, backed with hard right billionaire money, which has a model about that. But what is clear, I think, is there's an emerging capacity for what I'd describe as being bespoke demagoguery, where each individual is served a diet of content from candidates or civil society that is individually tailored to their prejudices and preferences. At some point, this becomes the antithesis of a democratic collective process. It's fundamentally different, in my view, from stressing different policies in your platform to different groups of voters. Even before the possibilities of fake news and voter suppression are considered, and this technology was used for voter suppression against the Democrats in the last presidential election, this removes any sense, in my view, that politics is about a collective process and a national, or even local for that matter, project. It's only a national conversation if there is versions of the one conversation, not a nation of different conversations. And it seems to me this technology has the capacity to do that. At a policy level, the micro-modelling of individuals has the potential to destroy what remains of our social solidarity, the sense that we're all in it together and collectively managing risk and cost to a certain extent. You're prone, of course, to hear those cartoonish libertarians complain about paying for other people's health care. The new technology brings their preferred dystopia potentially closer. To take one example, some people of health and means can, of course, self-insure against risk, and or at the very least pay a very tiny premium for some kind of catastrophe insurance. Similarly, the risk of unemployment is not the same for all of us. It depends on your age, your location, your education, and other matters. The time will be shortly there, in my view, where there'll be a serious political push based on you are paying for others and you don't have to anymore because we have the data. And that push will be to dismantle what remains of the architecture of collective risk management. I think that will include health. I think it will include unemployment insurance. It will also, the same logic will be used to block any attempt to manage newer or emerging risks. Of the two most obvious are extreme longevity, given increases in medical technology, and the possibility of widespread technological employment. Although I agree with Anna 100%, it is not inevitable, and societies make choices about these things. To return to my UBI scepticism for one moment, you can see the libertarian ideal of everyone buying what they need in an individualised market, tailored precisely to their needs based on the algorithm, with essentially no role left for our Commonwealth, and with diabolical consequences for those of us unlucky enough to need collective risk management, even if UBI existed. In my view, it's not overstating the case to say that a principal locus of our activity, to going back to Polanyi, to consciously subordinate the market to democracy, needs to be about how we consciously subordinate the algorithms and how we consciously democratise the operation of the algorithms. To conclude, a collective future is, in my view, necessary and it's possible. What we don't like about neoliberalism, as I said, is unpopular and can be beaten back. But I think it probably only can be if we accept that a collective future will not look entirely like the collective past. And it will only come, in my view, that if enough people who want to fight the bad outcomes of neoliberalism are prepared to embrace power, are prepared to widen their conception of collective organisation, if we abandon a history of tinkering and failed policy solutions, and if we combine mobilising with real organising, and if we come to terms with technology. Thanks very much.